people can kind of join in as we're doing intros. But all right, so everybody who's here so far, thanks so much for joining us. My name's Laura Browarny. I'm on the board of the Colorado-Wyoming Association of Museums, or QWAM, as we call it. We had a lot of questions about it. Is it QWAM or QUAM or whatever? So we say QWAM. I'm telling you this because I think we have a lot of out-of-state participants for this webinar, which is mount making. We actually decided to do this as a result of your feedback from one of our first rounds of webinars, where these three ladies did online portfolios. So some of you may remember them from that. I'm not going to take up too much more time, but I am curious to see where you're all coming from. So I think Jesse can throw up a poll just really quick to give me an idea of whether you're from our Colorado-Wyoming area, or if you're from somewhere else, if you guys wouldn't mind just voting really quick.
And then when I see they've all voted, do I end poll?
Yes, yep, okay. And then you'll just click like share results or something.
All right, I'm gonna give, there's a couple people left. Give it a second. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and share this out.
All right, so our other state people are kind of almost catching up with our Colorado participants, which is great. You'll be receiving a survey after the webinar. So if you would like to provide more feedback and tell us exactly where you're from, you'll have the chance to do that. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Jesse, Ashley, and Dominique, because they have a lot of really great stuff to talk about. I did want to let everybody know, if you have a specific question for our presenters here, please use the Q&A tool, which you can see down at the bottom of your screen, and type your questions into there. Because we're going to have so many people joining us, it'll be hard to use the chat feature for all of that. So you can use the chat to kind of check in with each other. If you have experiences or links to share, feel free to put them in the chat. But let's put all of our questions in the Q&A so that they can answer them as we go. All right, ladies, take it away.
Okay, hi everyone, welcome. I'm Jessie. I'm coming from California, and we just wanted to start off our webinar today with a land acknowledgement from us. And since we have so many people from out of state, I think it would be really exciting, since we view this webinar as a place of learning, if we can all kind of participate in this together, and if you would all feel welcome to drop your own kind of land acknowledgement in the chat. It gives you an opportunity to name and respect the people whose territory we're all meeting on or coming from or working on today, and create that space for ongoing education. And we'd like to acknowledge that land acknowledgements are also really complex and can be kind of formulaic or just like routine at sometimes, but we ask that everyone would just have kind of an intention to broaden your own understanding of your relationship to the land you're on and the land around you. So we'll give folks a few minutes maybe to just kind of drop those in the chat as we go through this introduction to the presentation, and then that'll give us, you know, another idea of where we're all coming from today. So today, like Laura told you, we're going to be talking about mount making for beginners. And we view this as part one, where we're just going to be going over some concepts and the basic information and examples you'll need. We want to give you an introductory overview, kind of a conceptual understanding of the process of mount making for both collections, education collections, and exhibitions. We're going to talk about materials, why we do this, give you lots of real world examples from all of our experiences, plus just lots of tips and tricks and principles you should know. We're gearing this largely towards students or emerging museum professionals, since this is like a very practical hands-on skill that you might want to get early on in your career. But we hope that anyone could get something out of this. Even if you do this every day for work, you might find some of this really repetitive, but you might still learn a new tip or trick. So we're your presenters. Like I said, my name is Jessie. I'm a preparator at the SFO Museum in the Bay Area in California. And then Dominique, you want to maybe say hello?
Hi, I'm Dominique. I am the Anthropology Collections Manager at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. Good afternoon.
Hi everyone, I'm Ashley Mugley and I work as the Assistant Collections Manager at the CU Museum of Natural History.
And I'll just add that I know Dominique and Ashley both from when we all worked at the CU Museum of Natural History, so that's how we all connected in Colorado. And like Laura said, we decided to do this webinar because we wanted to be really responsive to a need in this field. And when we did our last webinar about portfolios, we got a lot of feedback that people were like, wait, how did you learn mount making? How can I learn more mount making? How could I incorporate that into my portfolio? So we wanted to listen to that feedback and provide a professional development opportunity for folks looking to get that experience. So we have a second poll, and I might actually have to stop sharing my screen, I think, to launch that. So I'm gonna do that real quick. We're just curious about where you're approaching this topic from, why you're interested in this topic. So the poll should be up for you all to see now. And go ahead and just take a second to vote on that. I've gotten feedback from various people that their museum studies graduate program or undergraduate program or just their educational training didn't really give this kind of hands-on experience. And I know mine and Ashley's did. And so that was something that we thought we could, share back to folks who maybe didn't get that in their training or are trying to get that in their job, but are having trouble getting that kind of hands-on experience, especially now. So it looks like folks have largely voted. I'll give it a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share it out. Even if folks wanna keep voting, you can always contact us later about why you wanted to attend. I'm gonna go ahead and share that just so folks can see. It just seems like a lot of folks are either generally interested or really need these skills for their job, which has been the case but for a lot of us. All right, so that's good, useful information for all of us. I'm gonna stop sharing this and go back to sharing our presentation. Okay. And then the last thing we kind of wanted to get out of the way is that we viewed this as part one of the training, because the real way to learn this is to do it and to do some trial and error and to get your hands on some tools and to get your hands on some materials. And we would like to do that someday. It might be at a future QAM meeting. If next year's conference is virtual, maybe it's the following year, or maybe it's sometime next year in the Front Range area or in Wyoming. We'll just have to wait and see, but just know that that's kind of the goal. We know that this is a much more like hands-on practice. And we also have a resource bank for you, because this is a big, broad topic with lots of possible information to share. So this URL is going to be shared out in an email following this presentation, and that shared Dropbox folder has tons of resources for you to download. We'll put these slides in there so you don't have to worry about taking notes, and if you have like a really specific question that we can't answer, it's probably in one of those resources. And just to give you an idea, Ashley's going to start by taking you through an introduction about why we make mounts and what kind of storage supplies to use. And then Dominique's going to look at collections mounts and some tips and tricks for those. Ashley's going to share the work that she's done on education collections. And then I'm going to conclude by talking about exhibition mounts and give you some tricks for those. And then we'll have a Q&A. And like Laura said, if you can just throw those in the Q&A function. So Ashley, I'll turn it over to you.
So why do we make mounts? The answer is sometimes complex, but really it's just preventative conservation. So the purpose of preventative conservation is to maintain the condition of an object as well as manage deterioration risks. So this could be something from like object handling and environmental conditions. And since preservation in perpetuity is a common mission of museums, mount making can help you work towards achieving that goal. So here's a really short clip of an accident that occurred in a gallery. And so creating proper mounts that are, yes, the domino effect as we called it. So creating mounts that are properly secured can really help prevent objects from getting damaged. And so this is something to keep in mind. And so before you begin to make mounts, you should do a storage assessment. Creating proper mounts for objects often will increase the amount of storage your collection needs. It might be important to know how much space you're currently using and whether you even have room to expand once you start making mounts. So when you're doing a storage assessment, don't just consider the horizontal space that you're using, but also consider the vertical space. You might be able to make a mount like pictured over to the right that helps you utilize vertical space better and actually helps you open up room on a shelf or in a cabinet and allows you to make even more mounts for other objects in that space. So it's important to ensure you're physically able to do this type of project before jumping in. And another thing to consider is that the environment can play a huge role in determining what materials you should use. For instance, this is an example of foam sheeting. It's a very common material for mount making and collection storage, and it became literal dust upon touch. So this specific cabinet sits in front of a vent system, so the humidity and temperature changes are strong enough in that particular spot that it can cause degradation not only to the objects, but also the material that was used to create mounts for the objects. So if you have areas in your museum that you can't control the environment for at this moment, consider simple and cheaper mounts that can be changed out regularly versus more complex and expensive mounts, because you don't want to go invest in these really huge, expensive mounts just to have them maybe degrade because the temperature and humidity caused it to break down. And then if you determine you have the space for a rehousing and mount making project, you'll need to consider your budget. Depending on your budget, you can invest in some pre-made mounts that might be more complex, but you might decide that making custom mounts in-house with archival materials is a better option for you. Your budget will include not only the supplies that you use for the mounts, but also the time it will take for staff to complete the project. So be prepared to invest in your mount making. Also, if you have a really tight budget, buffered and unbuffered tissue paper is a great option. It can be very versatile in what types of mounts you end up making. This is something that Dominique will go over later when we talk more in depth about different mount examples. And so once you have your budget and your space figured out, you'll have to decide what objects you want to focus on. So each object will be different. There isn't a perfect one-size-fits-all approach. So before building a mount, consider the object materials, the size, the shape, the condition, as well as how much room you have to expand its space, how it will be accessed in collections by staff or by visitors, and how much it will cost. This can help determine what materials you should use, as well as what materials should not be used. So decide as a team what will be the best approach for you. Does it make sense to build mounts by object type? For example, starting with all your baskets, or you can focus on a similar type of object and then just make slight changes to that mount depending on, the different dimensions. But you might also decide to focus on a specific collection that might have different objects such as baskets, hats, footwear, and other materials. So getting an overview of what objects you will be working with will help determine how to go about making those mounts and what materials will be best for you. And so before starting, it's always good to have a training session with all staff members to go over basic safety. Because sharp blades and implements might be needed to make the mounts, it is good to make sure that everyone knows how to use those tools properly and prevent any accidents from occurring. Now, of course, accidents do happen, so it's good to, as a team, have a plan in place to really tackle that when it occurs so that you're not just like, oh my God, someone cut themselves, what do I do? So you kind of want to have that discussion before jumping in, just so when it happens, you know what to do and you can get the help you need. And so I'm going to be going through these quickly It's simply meant to be just kind of an overview. However, as Jesse said earlier, we have a resource bank for you all to access that has articles and other materials that go more in depth into why specific materials are archival and appropriate for collections. This webinar will also be available to you later, so don't feel like you have to take notes. So these are some of the principles that I'll be going over in the next few slides. So if a material isn't chemically stable or contains harmful substances, this can migrate to your objects and cause damage over time or mess with the data during research on the objects. It's important to use materials that are inert and stable. If you aren't sure about a specific material, you can usually find information online for products, or you can contact suppliers directly to answer your questions. So the photos to the right show some examples of containers that were used in the field during an archaeological excavation from a really long time ago. So these are made of cardboard that has gotten old and begun to break down. There's unknown plastic material that's become super brittle and damaged, as well as a metal medicine bottle that began to rust on the inside. So these are things that definitely need to be rehoused to better care for the objects within. And so when you're using paper-based materials, you'll want to use material made from wood pulp that has been chemically purified to remove harmful substances. So the image to the right shows tissue paper. It's yellowed and gone bad after years of being inside a cardboard box. And so not only did those harmful chemicals migrate into the tissue, it's also migrating into the object. So you just want to make sure that you're using something that has been purified so that this doesn't happen. And then pH levels will tell you how acidic or basic a material is. So a pH level of 7 is neutral. Anything under 7 is acidic, while anything above is basic. And so while finding the perfect level depends on the type of object specifically, a good range to be between is 7 and 8.5. There are pens that you can get, such as to the right, that will help you determine the acidity level of materials. So don't use these pens directly on objects, only use them on the storage materials themselves and somewhere that won't get in contact with the object. So usually like right inside the lid of like a box or something like that, you can just quickly make a little mark and then figure out what acidity level you're at. And then when we talk about buffered and unbuffered materials, this refers to whether the material has a buffering agent added to keep materials acidic, acid-free for longer. So buffering can help protect against migrating acids and can help neutralize acids as they form over time. So buffered supplies should be used with cellulosic or plant-based materials, while unbuffered should be used with protein-based materials and can also be used for cellulosic. So if you're ever in doubt about the type of buffered or unbuffered material you should use, unbuffered material is the go-to recommendation for all objects. If you do decide to invest in both buffered and unbuffered, just make sure to label them properly. You don't want to accidentally use buffered materials with protein-based objects. This can cause damage or can affect chemical analysis research later on. And then plastics will degrade in off-gas, but there's still safe plastics that you can use in collections. Avoid using plastics that don't meet preservation standards, as they're not only going to deteriorate themselves, but can cause deterioration to not only the objects they touch, but others in the storage space. So like before, you will want to make sure that the plastics you use are chemically stable and inert. Listed on the slide are some examples of plastics that are safe, as well as plastics that should never be used in collections. And again, we have additional resources available in our resource bank that goes into more specifics about safe plastics for collections use. And then when using fabrics to rehouse objects, such as rugs and other textiles as shown to the right, you want to make sure you use unbleached, undyed cotton or linen fabrics. These materials are naturally stable. Before using them in your collection, make sure that you wash the material and use a detergent without additives. And invest in unsized fabrics, as this can cause fabrics to become really stiff. It can become fire or water resistant, and this could impact collections. And then once you've ordered all the appropriate supplies, make sure that you're labeling them as they're coming into your collection space. So create a specific place to house the materials. and make sure to train everyone on where this material needs to be returned to after use. So labeling materials can help you tell good and bad materials apart. They can be visually indistinguishable at times, especially like buffered and unbuffered paper. You're never going to know just by like looking at it. But it can also help you easily check if you're running low on something, so you can order more if needed. And I'd recommend labeling not only the type of product, but the specific brand and the product code, because this can really help save you during reordering, so you don't have to go back through the entire process again to figure out what you were using before. And then here's just a quick overview of some supplies that are good to have on hand. They're very useful for making and customizing storage mounts for collections use. So these are just some of the recommended. It's not all encompassing, but it's a good place to start. And then here's another list of tools that will be useful to help you make mounts for objects. If you're missing any of the supplies below and will need them for the mounts you're making, just be sure to add them to your budget so you have them ready to go once all of your supplies arrive. And then Dominique, if you want to show some of the examples of collection mounts.
All right. So there's more than one way to make a good mount. Every institution has their own style, and what I found is there are more similarities than differences. It's really just a matter of like just the specific style they choose to use, but there's no need to be, you know, rigid in that way. The idea is that you really just want to prioritize the safety of the object. So when you're in a collection storage and you're visiting all these different museums out there, a lot of folks have trays, and trays are the simplest thing to make, right? You can buy them in bulk, pre-cut, or assembled already, or you can assemble them yourself, or you can customize by cutting your own boards out of blue board and making them yourself. The idea is that, you know, you can also make templates to cut your own. So there's lots of different ways. You have chambered ones, you have individual ones, and you can arrange them in the drawer to fit so that it maximizes your space. And then this is a slightly more complex. The reason this was ended up being a trapezoidal shape is because they were trying to maximize the amount of space it could take in the cabinet. So if you had a big square one, you'd have kind of like these dead ends of space, but by kind of arranging differently shaped boxes, you can maximize that. So if that's a concern for you, they don't all have to be pretty rectangles. Do what works. And so boxes, you can have an open face box, and then you can have it with or without a lid, right? And the reason to add a lid is if you need to give it some additional protection. And these can get more complex. You've seen in a previous slide an example of a stacked box tray. This one on the top here has a drop front box, so that way, you know, you don't have to be lifting every single layer out. You can drop it down and then you can see inside into the objects. And then if you don't or can't use a hot glue to fasten your walls, you can always use twill tape. The example at the bottom, this was a tribe that had requested all natural materials, and that's fair. So these are just different ways of lacing it. And then boxes can get increasingly complex from there. You can have drop front box, or this is a window box. So if you want to be able to see inside to look at the object, I've seen in several institutions where lots of tours come through collections, and maybe they don't all want to see these closed wall boxes and not be able to see a single artifact. So Mylar windows are really helpful for that. The technique for it is just that because Mylar is really smooth, you have to sand it with sandpaper, the edges, so that when you glue it down with a hot glue, and you kind of have to work really quickly, then it has a surface for the glue to stick on. And then these are examples of drop front boxes for when you have really tall objects, because again, you don't want to be reaching inside the box. I mean, for that bird, you literally can't. So the idea is to be able to pull it out through the front. And again, as your boxes get more complicated, you always want to make sure that your instructions are really clear for how to open and remove the object, because the idea is that any user should be able to open that mount and take that object in and out safely. So at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, our conservator, when we embarked on this giant mount making and move project over 6-7 years ago now, she decided that we would not be using adhesives at all in our mounts. So, so what do you do when you can't use glue? Basically, our technique uses friction and gravity, and I'll walk you through this. In the resources bank, there are actually live videos demonstrating how to make a mount from start to finish. And oh, okay. So the idea is that, you know, with our big group of volunteers, is that it's a matter of scale, right? At the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, we're talking about thousands of objects and over 50 volunteers over the course of a week. But right now, in the time of COVID, there's 2 of us, and it's fine. The process works on both ends of the scale. Obviously, we're not pumping out as much volume, but the technique is still there. It's very much a kind of assembly line style. Like, I don't take an object and then measure the box, and then cut the box, and then build the box. You do them in batches. And if you're only making them out for 1 or 2 objects, that's okay. But if you want to scale it up, we found it's more efficient to do the assembly line, breaking it down into steps. And when you bring in more volunteers and more staff, the idea is that to help people be really self-sufficient and be able to pick up the process at any stage in that assembly line. So what we use are cavity mounts, and this is basically, it is a cavity that is custom shaped to the shape of that object so that that object cannot wiggle in there at all. And so we line the cavity with Tyvek. It's just like construction grade, it's the same material as construction Tyvek, but this is archival grade Tyvek. And when it's woven, you end up with a rough side and a smooth side. And to avoid abrasion on the object, you want to make sure that the smooth side is facing the artifact. So this technique was developed by Bethany Williams, who is now at the History Colorado. And when you're thinking about building a box, right, you have the actual dimensions of the object, plus a little bit of allowance to give it some breathing room, plus the height of the walls times 2, because you have 2 walls on either side. So that's a lot of math. And so what she did was create an Excel formula, and this will also be provided in the resources sheet. And what it does is that it auto-calculates factoring in all of those things. And it helps reduce error, because sometimes, you know, even if you measure twice and cut once, you build a box and suddenly you realize, my artifact doesn't fit. Now I have an extra box and I gotta hope that something else that will be able to fit into that box. But this way you can reduce the amount of error. And then you can see in the column for length, so that's maximum length. It's not necessarily the orientation of the object, but to help cut down on waste, as we cut the boards, we look for similar size lengths. Like I see a couple of 31s on there, and I have a 31-inch board. Great, I'm going to cut that. I'm going to cut all the 31-inch boards off of the big 31-inch board. So and then that helps really like cut down on waste as well. And what we have is the Fletcher 3000. It is a wall-mounted cutter, and It's totally fine if you don't have the room or the space or the budget for one of these. You can still cut and crease boards manually using just a simple bone folder, your T-square or ruler, and a knife. It will not be as fast, but that's still totally okay. You can still assembly line that process by cutting all your boards at the same time. And so the other thing is, once you're, as you saw from the Excel spreadsheet, once you have 20 boards cut out, your staff or your volunteers need to be able to tell and take that board and match it up to the object that is supposed to go inside that box. So you just want to really make it clear when you're labeling the boards, like what is the object? So we have the catalog number here, the height of the box, and then where is that object located? So R2.4, so we have several racks. They're just big open racks. And so this is telling me it's on rack number 2, shelf 4. And then the direction arrow just tells me when I put the board down onto the table, that arrow is facing toward my stomach. It's not as important for the trays, which can kind of be oriented in any direction, but when you're making drop fronts or any of the more complex boxes where there is a front, you really do want to pay attention to the directional arrow. And again, this is just to keep it simple and clear for your staff and volunteers, like what they need to do next. And so what ends up happening is this assembly line style. So we have a stack of boards on the right and a stack of boxes on the left. So when a volunteer staff person comes into work, they can scan the room. Once you have them trained up, they can just scan the room and see, okay, the artifacts are over there. Here's a stack of boxes. Let me pick up this box, put it together, and then they can add it to the pile of boxes over on the left. And then should they so choose, they can just, maybe that day they only want to make boxes. We have some volunteers who love making cavities. So what they look for is a big stack of completed boxes so they can start putting together those cavity mounts. And I'm gonna just run through this really quickly, how the box goes together. We first start with cutting your flaps and the slivers. And the slivers, that's just taking off the edge of the flap so that when it's on a shelf, it doesn't drag. And it also it also works for aesthetics, like it looks good. And then when you're punching the holes for the rivets, you also want to think about ergonomics, if you have the resources to do so, right? Some volunteers are very petite and some volunteers are really tall. And, if the table is set at an awkward height, that can create stress injuries. And the same thing for using these tools. You don't want them, if you go to the next slide, you don't want them punching into the box sideways. It is more ergonomic to punch down. So the idea is that you punch the holes in the flap, and then you punch pilot holes into the wall, and you turn it over and you punch down and finish the punching the holes on the sidewall. And then what happens next, instead of using hot glue, we use rivets with the male end and the female end. And basically what we do is you take each of them and then you press them together with your fingers into the holes, and then we take a hammer and lightly tap them into place to complete the fit. The next thing that happens is that we cut there's the pallet that is cut to the size of the box, as well as the piece of foam. And so what you do is then you trace the artifact with you trace the artifact to the foam. And please, please, please do not use a pen or a marker to do this. There's a very high risk of accidentally, you don't want to mark your object, but you especially don't want to mark it with a pen, because then it's, not good. And what we found is, if it's really tough for you to see the pencil markings, we use a 4B pencil, and that helps make a darker line on the foam. And just trace the outline of the object. And then this is kind of where we do the cavity slightly different from most institutions. So the idea is that you take your blade, and again, for ergonomics, you cut straight down all the way through the foam. As you see in the middle photo, you completely cut out all the way through the entire outline of the object. I've seen it done and have myself done cavities by kind of slowly carving out bits of foam. And that works. It makes a lot of mess. And you can get into sketchy territory with your blade. You know, if you're carving and it's just pointing in a bad direction, it can be a higher risk for injury. Certainly cut-proof or cut-resistant, there's no cut-proof glove, cut-resistant gloves on, you know, the non-cutting hand is a great safety precaution to do. And then you're handling the object multiple times as you fit it in and out of the cavity as you are carving it. But this one, we cut all the way through, and then you slice the cut out like part way, depending on the height of your box and the height of your object. And then you pop that cutout right back into the mount, and yeah, you basically end up with the shape of the artifact, but without the mess. And then we add this additional step called a finger lift point. So when you have a cavity that's snug to the outline of the artifact, it can be hard to pick it up. So you just add, you know, a couple of like finger-shaped curves, and so that someone can reach in and lift that out. And then to do the Tyvek tucking, you also have to carve an outline around your outline. You'll see it in the next slide, but you carve an outline around your outline to create tuck points. So you have a tuck point where you tuck the Tyvek into your cutout piece to get it anchored, and then you tuck it into the tuck point outline, and that's how you end up with a fully tucked Tyvek cover. And then to hold the whole thing together, you have a palette, and you weave twill tape through the palette, and then you place the foam on top, and you just tuck the ends. You make a little cut, and you tuck the ends of the twill tape into the foam. So it's all friction and gravity. And finally, and I suppose you could take me to task for this, we do use adhesives for the labels and barcodes, but either way, you just want to mark it clearly, the number of the object, so that someone can see it when they're looking into your cabinet or a shelf. And you can write that on with a Sharpie or a marker, or cover it in adhesive like we do. But yeah, it's so you can just tell the boxes apart when they're all together on a shelf. So that's the essence of our cavity mount system. Certainly, it uses a lot of resources in terms of board and twill and rivets and foam, and so you don't have to go this complicated. It's yeah, you know, like, for us it's an ideal, but we understand it may not be realistic for different institutions based on budget and size, and that's totally okay. So this is a carrying board, and it's pretty simple because you just have your board, and then you weave the twill tape to it, and then you tie it around your object. And you just want to make sure that your object is stable and that you're not tying it too tightly and putting pressure on the object. But this, you know, you can move the object without touching the object directly, and that's really the whole idea, right? So yeah, it can save space. Bumpers, so these are, so a backer rod is basically foam tubing, and it comes in a big roll. And you can cut it to as long or as short to make all sorts of different shapes, which you'll see examples of. This is a bumper system where, you know, it's keeping long, narrow objects in place, or it's buffering the object on the sides, you know, creating a buffer on the walls, so it's not sliding and bumping into the wall. And then of course you can do different variations on inserts and pads. For this example, these are Tyvek covered wedges. And instead of making a full ring or a full cavity, maybe you just need to create 3 or 4 points to support the object. And that often works really, really great. Here's an awesome example of a very fragile basket that got both internal and external support. So it had wedges all along the outside, but you can see it's also kind of collapsing on the inside. So there was an internal mount to hold the shape in place, but then the outside wedges to keep it from bowing out further. And of course, the more complex your mount is, you should have some sort of like instruction sheet or explanation with it, so that the end user who may not be a mount maker or isn't, it's not immediately obvious what to do, they have that as reference. And these are more variations on inserts and pads. You can cut and shape any kind of Tyvek pillow with poly batting and insert it into the object. And that's just to give it a support, especially if you have, soft baskets and, soft baskets and moccasins and other things, especially with like stuff that can get crunchy in dry climates, like in Colorado, which is what happens with hide out here. The best passive support is often like a simple pad. And for this example, they took a pool noodle. Pool noodles are polyethylene foam. You want to make sure it's not dyed, of course. And then you just wrap it up with your Tyvek or your tissue and tuck it into the object. And that's really cheap and simple, and it's great. And then of course you have, different variations on pot rings. And this is where you can get really creative with your backer rod. You can shape it in all sorts of different ways and use that to support the object. It's kind of like, it's a little bit like arts and crafts in the sense that, there's no one right way to do it. You experiment with what is best for that specific object. So I'm not like, for instance, these ladles, like there's no one way to make a ladle mount, because all ladles are different shapes and sizes, but you want to support the base and you want to support the stem, and so you create something that can do that. And then you get some really specialized objects like conical bottom baskets where you can't really put it on the base, so you can take a pot ring and then like elevate it on stilts, so that's really fun to do. And of course, hat mounts. And with hat mounts, you can have, a foam support. You can pad it out with additional batting if you need to. And then you can cover it in stockinette or Tyvek and then place the object on top. And of course, hats are all different shapes and sizes. In the bottom example, that is a basket hat. And so even though it looks smooth on the outside, the inside is it's very textured and rough. So like a stockinette or Tyvek would not work because it will snag. So she ended up making, a kind of inverted pot ring system. Like it's supporting it at the top, it's supporting it at the collar, or the brim, I suppose is what that would be. And that way there's less contact and that material is really smooth, so it's not catching on the texture of that object. And finally, if you have lots of archaeological collections or tiny beads or anything really small, and like even too small for a tray, you can always put them in bags. And the great thing about bags is that you can always put them into different shapes and styles of boxes so that you can nest them. And the whole idea is to save space. So, you know, depending on the size and shape of your cabinet, you can still, you can stack them, you can make them as wide or as deep or add as many rows or columns as you need to, but it's all about maximizing that space. All right, so some basic tips and tricks. Like I just showed you a ton of examples, and some of them are like way amazing, and that's great, but before jumping into just like building something epic and huge, like think about where it's gonna go, right? That determines how big and how complex you can make that mount. If your space doesn't allow you to make individual you know, cavity mounts, that's okay. Maybe you make that for a few special items, but everybody else gets a tray with a little bit of tissue. That's totally okay. It totally depends on your conditions, your space, and your budget. And if anything else, if you can only choose one item, choose a roll of tissue. Like Ashley said, unbuffered can come into contact with everything. So tissue is very versatile because you can use it to make pads and stuff objects with it. If you don't have acid-free boxes, but you do have tissue, you can use a tissue to line that box, so at least you have a barrier for that migration that Ashley was describing. You can use tissue for rolling objects, all sorts of, and even just as a huge dust cover. And it's really quite affordable as well. And other practical considerations, like you saw, we trim the edges of our flaps so it doesn't catch on things. It can still happen, accidents happen, but you know, you want to cut or round your corners to try to prevent damaging other objects nearby. And the other thing you need to know is that hot glue comes in both high melt and low melt. And also, depending on the glue gun, it can use high melt. It can have multiple settings and be set to really high or low. So depending on the application, you know, you want high melt glue for boards, but low melt glue for foam. So this is a fun video. Oh, the sound didn't work. But anyways, so this is.
Oh, it might be because I'm muted.
Oh, sure.
Always make sure to take the little spider webs off, because otherwise it's just going to be all over your painting and look beyond.
Yes, and Paris Hilton is absolutely right. Hot glue, no matter the temperature, tends to give off these like little spider webs that just get everywhere. And the spider webs are harmless, but you know, you want to make sure it doesn't catch on your object or on the box or anything like that. So yeah, and just remember, it's a process. Examine your object and then decide what materials you need, right? Don't just jump into the process. Like, you really have to start back at step one and like figure out what your object needs. And then of course, as you're building it, like think about, you know, the end user and how they will be able to access that access the mount and access the object within that mount when you're gone. Because, you know, if they open the box and it doesn't make sense how to take it out or put it back in, you know, that's just additional risk to the object. So yeah, just make sure, yeah, that it's doable for like someone who's not necessarily a collections person. And finally, just document your process. In your resource bank, we also have the written instructions for the mount making process at DMNS. So you have video, written, and again, there's no one method that you have to adhere to. So check out different places and how they make their mounts, and then choose the elements that work for you and your staff. Figure out what's effective and efficient for your institution. And yeah, and that'll help cut down on wasted time and money. And I'll turn it back over to Ashley for education collection mounts.
So most education collections are intended to be handled by children and the public, and so it's accepted that accidents can and will happen, and that will cause damage to the objects. And so while not everyone will go out and start building all these mounts for their education collection, it's definitely something to keep in mind if maybe you're not a collections person, but you're an educator and you're just kind of interested in why we build these mounts and what they can do. So they can be helpful to support objects on exhibit cards, make handling of materials easier for staff or visitors, and help keep track of materials as they're being used. So the next slide. So this is a pendulous nest that was used during a classroom program, and this was at Denver Museum of Nature and Science. That's where all of these examples are going to be from. For this particular object, the mount allowed for support of the object, and so it demonstrated how it looks hanging vertically like it would be in nature, and it provided a sturdy enough base for educators to hold so that they could move it around the classroom and show students without having to actually touch the object itself. And so the Denver Museum of Nature and Science also uses a color coding system for their education collections. So green tags usually note that an object can be held and touched and interacted with and manipulated. Yellow tag, as you can see below the first image and on the final image, those say that it's a one-finger touch. So this is usually the back of your finger, just touching it so that you can get a feel for it, but it helps cut down any unnecessary touching and handling that could cause damage. And then they also use red, and this lets staff as well as visitors know that the object shouldn't be touched at all. This might be something that either is just really fragile, or it could be something, you know, like a bird taxidermy mount that might have arsenic or something like that, that could be harmful. And so this is just something to keep in mind, that these tags and these mounts can really help give visitors and staff kind of clues on what is acceptable. DMNS also uses black Ethifoam mounts specifically to help keep education collections visually separate from the research and permanent collections. And then this is an example of another mount for education collections. So this was used inside of an exhibit. The mount was created to keep objects secure. They're tied down with some like fishing line, but allowed visitors to get a sense of what collections look like behind the scenes of a museum. So they brought in some of the collection storage cabinets, and then we put the education collections inside of them. We built these mounts up so that they're easy for children to see who are really short. They can still get a look in, but it kind of gives them a sense of what we're doing behind the scenes and that we're building these mounts to help preserve objects that we're taking care of. And then this is a final example. So this is some cavity mounts that were created. So because the exhibit was about bioluminescence, the objects were meant to be interacted with by the public. And so you can see they're sitting right under like a black light so that you can get a sense of what they look like when they're under that light, what colors they end up glowing. But you could also grab those mounts or the objects themselves, pull them out of that light, look at what they look like normally when they're not under a black light. So it was something that was really heavily interacted with, and these were items that were constantly being touched, handled, moved, you know, discussed with visitors. So having these mounts really gave staff as well as visitors a place to put them back. These objects could just go straight back into the place that they came from. It was really easy to keep track of things. So because people are constantly interacting with them, it gave staff just a quick visual to look down the line and say, you know, that mount is missing an object, where's the object? And so it's just something to kind of keep in mind, that mounts can be important also when engaging with visitors, just so that, you know, everyone kind of knows where everything is, they know what they're looking at, it's just useful. And then Jesse will talk about exhibit mounts specifically.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that insight into education collections, because it's not something I necessarily think about right away with mount making, but it's great to see how important it is in a variety of kinds of exhibits. So I'm going to be talking about mounts used for displaying objects, and I want to talk about those as separate from collections mounts, because the purpose is a bit different. We're a lot more concerned about aesthetics. We're a lot more concerned about the visual experience for the viewer. And that often means that the materials that we use are different, and then the tools that we would need are different, and then some of the skills that we would need are different. But the same principles all apply, that the safety of the object comes first. We're still concerned about preventative conservation. We just have some other considerations to take in mind. And just a brief note about scope. That's more, these pictures are more what I do, is like smaller 2D and 3D objects, but not necessarily going to be talking about like large outdoor sculpture that requires like cranes and rigging. And I'm not really going to be talking about mounting paintings or flatworks on walls. I think a lot of us have some idea of how to do that just based on maybe our own homes or our own experience. Or that could be kind of a separate thing that we talk about in a different webinar or in a different presentation, because it's much more specific to that kind of work, but then these principles can apply to all kinds of 3D objects. So the basic principles of what not to do is that no object should ever be altered to suit a mount. That has happened. I've seen that in older exhibits where stuff has been like hot glued, or a nail put through an object, or even like a hole cut out of an object to mount it. And that's not something we do anymore. It's not a best practice. It might have happened in the past, but we shouldn't be continuing it. So essentially just no invasive measures. And then you want to make sure that you're not using elements of the object to support itself. Like just because it has a hook or a hole for hanging, it doesn't necessarily mean you should be using it. There could certainly be exceptions to that, but you want to be creating your own mechanical solution, not using the mechanical solution that could put further stress on the object. And then just visually, we're trying not to make the mount stand out more than the object. And I'll end this little section with some examples of here's the mounts, and then here's the display. Can you still see them? Yeah. And so I'm distinguishing these two kinds of categories of exhibition mounts only to say that it doesn't have to be as complicated as it might seem. Like there are some very generic kinds of solutions that are maybe ready-made or just require like low time, low cost. There's a really low barrier to learning it. But there are also these more complex things that we might have seen in some other museums that take a little more time, a little more expense, a little more material, tools, training, and all that. But it's not a hard line. You could be doing a ton of custom mounts in a show, and then the next show might be all just objects on a deck with a barrier. So it's a very, squiggly line. Sorry. And then just some examples that I'm going to go through visually pretty quickly here. Some generic mounts could be like just a barrier between the shelf and the furniture and the object. It could be something just like a board that's supporting the object. It could be a pot ring like we've shown. Maybe you cover it in some stockinette so it looks nicer or something, but it could just be a pot ring. It could be a magnet or a pin or a strap. It could even be wax. And then some more custom mounts that I'll show too are like brass mounts, steel mounts, paddles and brackets used to hold things on a wall, plexiglass, mannequins, things that require like some custom work, some carving, some welding, some cutting, all those kind of skills. So here's just an example of something really simple. These baskets are just sitting on a glass shelf or on little risers. And there's no like mechanical items holding them in place because they're all pretty stable. One of them does have a pot ring there, but there is a layer of mylar between the object and the shelf. And that was because mylar's it's an archival material, but it's also clear. And so people could still see through the shelf to the bottom of the object because some of them were very decorative, and that was a concern for the show of wanting to show off like the feathers and the beads on the bottoms of the baskets. So you always want to kind of be thinking about what barriers you're using and what's the way they're going to be displayed. And then these are some examples of just boards that we've done in shows at the SFO Museum, and most of these are examples from the SFO Museum in San Francisco. And so these objects, these little bags, are just supported on a board that's upholstered with a safe archival fabric, and not all fabrics are created equal, like we said earlier, and that still applies to exhibitions. And then some of these have magnets on them so that there's a metal plate on the board and then a fabric over that, and then the magnet on top of the object connects to that metal to hold it in place. But if your object is super, super lightweight and just the very thin grit of the fabric might be enough friction to like hold it in place. So a board itself might be sufficient. And then these are some examples of ready-made mounts that you could get from a company like University Products. And again, you'll see that in the resource bank, that there's plenty of companies that sell basic exhibition mounts. You want to make sure you're going through a company that sells specifically like archival quality materials, because if you're just buying stuff from like, you know, a thrift store, little plate mounts or something, it might, those chemicals might still migrate to an object. But you could get things like these book holders or a ready-made mannequin, or even some ready-made brass mounts that you can then tweak and bend to the shape of an object. And this is an example of when I've used wax to hold something down. And my big grain of salt or caveat with wax is that you really need to consult with your conservation colleagues or collection staff or registrars to make sure that there's a plan in place that if wax is being used to hold something in place during a show, that there's a plan for its removal after the show. And wax can't be used with all kinds of objects, like anything really porous, like wood, unglazed ceramic, variety fabric, anything like that, like anything porous, the wax will get into the object, and that's an invasive measure that we're not trying to use. But for certain items like some plastics or metal, it might be all right. So these lamps are being held in with very, very, very tiny balls of wax on the feet just to prevent them from bouncing around if there's an earthquake or if there's someone bumps into the case. And then similarly to the boards I showed earlier, these textiles are being held in place with that kind of magneting system where there's a wooden board with a metal plate screwed into it, and then upholstery on top for a softer surface for the object, and then the magnet on top of the object is covered in a barrier material, and then it's connecting to the metal underneath. And then pins are a great solution. It's the same kind of concept that we were showing with like those supports in the collections mounts. You're just trying to prevent movement in every direction so that, yeah, if there's any impact or an earthquake or someone bumps into it, it's not gonna go backwards or go forwards or go to the side. So you're just thinking about those movement points and pinning it in place so that it has something to bump up against. And here you're thinking about barrier materials like shrink tubing that can cover the pins. So that's the same kind of archival plastics you can use as shrink tubing so that there's a barrier between the metal, which is usually like stainless steel or brass, and the object. And then plastic polyethylene strapping is really commonly used. It's great for things like books or works on paper or documents, where even the slightest breeze could lift that thing up. Like if you're opening the case, a breeze could send that thing off into the air. And so strapping it down really lightly, like we do with twill tape in collections, is a great way to prevent any movement, but just a reminder that you're doing that very gently just to prevent like a breeze from lifting it, not impacting the object by tying it down really tight. Yeah, so these are like those socks have poly strapping on them, and these little stamps have very thin straps that are adhered. The straps are adhered to the mat board, and then they're just holding the stamp, can slide in and out of those straps. And then something you'll see at a lot of museums that have the budget to make custom mounts, or maybe they can contract them out, are brass mounts. Brass is a metal that's incredibly soft and pliable, and you can bend it to the exact shape of an object. It requires heat, and that's usually like in oxyacetylene or oxygen and hydrogen brazing. So there's a lot of safety concerns and training that needs to happen there. But if you have a kind of a complex object, or just the display is complex, like you need it displayed up in the air or off of a wall or something, then brass is a great solution for that. And similarly, steel mounts work kind of the same way. It's just a really hard metal, so it can take weight. So for really heavy objects at the airport, we use, we'll have like a plane door or an engine from an airplane that's super heavy, and brass would just crumple under that. But steel welded together in a custom shape can support that kind of weight. Then here are some brass paddles, which again, it's the same concept as like pins or as the like ethafoam blocks, where you're just creating a few points to hold something in place so that it doesn't move around. So with a vase like this, a really heavy vase, I'm just finding 3 points for a circle to anchor it. And then those paddles curve to the shape of the vase because it's brass and I can bend it. And that can go up to a certain height so that it won't tip. So that's the kind of thing you can do with paddles. Brackets work pretty similarly. In the bottom there, you can see those bags are held in with plexiglass paddles. And that's just because it's, a pin would have been too sharp and pointy to put near a soft bag like that, but a wider flat paddle works great for holding that kind of thing in place. And for paintings on the wall, like I mentioned earlier, we're not using the hardware inherent to the painting. So it might have like D-rings or hooks on the back to hang it on a wall. And that might be how you would hang it in your home. But for the exhibition, we would make these brass brackets. And so you can kind of see them poking out, 2 on the bottom, 2 on the top, and 2 on the sides. And the ones on the top drop in and out, so you can pull them out and then lift the painting out. And that's just a mechanical solution that doesn't involve using anything on the painting to hang it. And then inserts, very similar to collections mounts here. We're using exactly the same materials, like carving, ethafoam, covering it in batting, and covering it in stockinette. And so that can work for things like hats, this is that same hat, or mannequins. You can also buy a lot of mannequins, but if you need a very custom shape, you might need to carve your own. And then plexiglass or acrylic is another material that we really commonly use, and that it's clear. So that's the great attribute that we used it for this show of like model airplanes, where we wanted it to look like they were flying through the sky. And if we'd used a lot of like metal and brass and wooden shelving, suddenly you don't get that aesthetic anymore. But we can use plexiglass, which provides the same kind of support and is similarly like manipulable. You can bend it with heat, you can cut it like wood, and then it gives that clear appearance. And over there you can see some examples of book mounts where we're using that poly strapping to hold down the actual pages. But then for the cradle to support the books, you could use plexiglass. It's probably the most commonly used, but you can also use like wood with a different kind of barrier, like mylar or something in between. And that just goes to the aesthetics. Like I think those wooden book mounts were for a folk art show, and so we wanted a more folksy appearance. But typically we'll use plexiglass cradles so that you can see like the cover of the book through the plexiglass. I think leverage mounts are just great to point out because they're so simple and so cool if you want to make something float in the air. So those canes, it's the same folk art show. And a leverage mount, I'm going to try to demonstrate with my pen. It's just opposing forces. So it's really simple, it's really tiny, it's just 2 little loops, and that can kind of suspend something, something very stable up in the air. And then we use scrolls every now and then for works on paper, or even maybe for like a textile that's meant to be rolled. And this is just like a plexiglass tube with some brackets on the side so that you can roll that tube back and forth. And then the wallpaper here is just rolled out from the scroll onto a panel. Yeah, so those were my examples of different kinds of exhibition mounts. And I'm just going to walk through some tips and tricks, and then we'll open it up to questions here in just a moment. And if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the Q&A function. So the same principle applies. Every object is unique. You can buy these like generic mounts or these generic tools, but you're always going to have to be doing some kind of custom work. So just preparing for that in terms of staff time and training, that there's no one size fits all way to do this. There might be ways you can repeat something across an object type, but you always have to be kind of thinking of each object as unique. And like I said earlier, you know, we're just trying to make these display mounts as unobtrusive for the audience as possible, if that's the goal. I think Ashley's example is great, where like you want to show the mount process in collection, so then maybe you're not so concerned with like unobtrusive appearance, but in other displays you might be really, the curators and designers might be really interested in hiding the mounts as much as possible. But it's not what your eye should go to, but you still need enough support that the object is very safe. And that being said, it's a negotiation. It's a negotiation between departments, you know, curatorial, design, conservation, registration, fabricators are all going to have kind of different needs and different concerns, and coming all together to make a solution that will work for the object and for the exhibit often just involves a lot of discussion. You're having discussions about aesthetic versus function. You know, you need the mount to function in a certain way. Like a great example is those paddles. I needed them to come up the side of the vase to a certain height so that the vase can't tip. But if they're really high, then what's that big line on the side of the vase? You know, it's just always kind of a negotiation between function and aesthetic. And then it's between you and the object, in the same way with collections mounts. If you're sitting there with the object, you're responsible for kind of figuring out what it needs in consultation with your colleagues. And safety first, always here as well. Before any work begins, you need to be thinking about PPE, like we're all familiar with now. For a lot of these processes, you need to wear a respirator or a mask. Getting your staff trained on that kind of equipment and safety equipment is really important. Learning how to use tools properly, and then learning how to interact with and handle objects safely in this kind of work is all initial training that should happen before you start fabricating. And likewise, make sure that kind of documentation of that process is available to your staff. So considering safety of the object, there's a lot of different barrier materials we can use. I've shown a few examples, but just to go through them real quick, Mylar is great. It's clear, it's archival. You can use tissue. You can use mat board that's used in framing, but it doesn't have to be in a frame. You can use it for all kinds of stuff. Some fabrics, safe fabrics, shrink to, which is usually like a polyethylene plastic as well. Polyethylene suede, which is shown there at the base in those little circles. That's just suede that has an adhesive backing. Or polyethylene felt, which is just like the suede. It usually has an adhesive backing, and so you can put it on a mount, or you can put it on the base as a barrier material. And then I included this other photo just so you could see that we use those same barrier options when we're just testing the mount. Not in the exhibit, it's not on display yet, but anytime these kind of metals or woods or anything is coming in contact with the object, you still need a barrier material. Even if it's just for a moment, even if it's just for a few minutes, you still need something in between. And then likewise, this presentation is going to be in the resource bank, so I'm not going to go through all these tools, but this is just a list for you to have of like the very basic stuff I have on my tool cart, and then a ton of just like weird little custom tools that I've used for various projects. But keeping these kind of basic tools in hand is a great place to start. And these are the materials that we're typically working with: wood, metal, plastic, fabric, paper, paint. So those are materials that you might want to like take a class in or watch some videos about, or just like get a little familiar with the terminology or what kind of problems you might encounter with each material. And then I want to just kind of wrap this section up by showing you one of my favorite things to do with display mounts, which is painting them to match an object so that they're a little more hidden, going back to aesthetics. And I included these pictures of ceramics because these were my favorite mounts that I ever painted, because I love ceramics and I love these colors. And so I had these little brass paddles And I would have to look at the object and be like, okay, it's a mustardy yellow, and then go to the paint table in a separate room down the hall and make different colors and make different mustards, and then paint them on a swatch, come back into the room and compare them and go, it's that color, and then paint my mounts that color. And I've seen some people do it like right up against the object with a barrier in between and paint to get really precise, but that's really going to be up to your staff in your museum of whether you can have paint in the same room, whether you need to do it outside the room in a different way. But thinking how you're going to kind of disguise your mounts can be actually a very fun and artistic process. So these are my last photos where I want to show you, this is what the mounts look like in our lab before the objects are in, and then that's the exhibit. And so our goal as mount makers for exhibitions is to not be seen and to not have anyone know what work we've really done. And so the fauxing is part of that, and the minimal amount of material to meet the function. So I hope you can look through that photo and this photo to see like what all the mounts look like on their own, and then what they actually look like with the objects in, and hopefully they're not too visible. Oh dang, I guess I did have some more stuff, sorry guys. Documentation, cannot emphasize this enough. I know we've emphasized it over and over, but it's so important to document your work for your own staff and for anyone who might be encountering your work that isn't you and doesn't know how to put something together the way you did. So making templates can help reduce the handling of an object, tracing the footprint like you would for a cavity mount so that you don't have to touch the object as much. Labeling your mounts so that you can transport them from storage into a display and still know what object goes with them. And then leaving instructions for your colleagues in case you're not the one installing the work. Or you'll end up with this. And this isn't really how you should store your mounts, and it's not how we store our mounts, but we were moving buildings and we didn't want to throw out all the mounts because brass is expensive and there's lots of, you can cut it down and sand all the paint off and reuse it. So we didn't throw them out, but who wants that kind of mess? So label your mounts. Okay, and so we can open it up to Q&A now. It looks like there's some in the chat, but essentially we've covered why we make mounts, what supplies we use to make mounts, collections mounts, education collections mounts, and exhibition mounts. Just giving you the resource link one more time, but know that it will come to you in an email. And then if you want to continue this education that you're getting on mounts, there's the International Mount Makers Forum is coming up at the end of October, and you can register for that online. It's virtual and it's free. And then there's another webinar coming up in a couple weeks through ARCS, the Association of Registration and Collection Specialists, and they're doing a webinar about choosing safe materials for collections. So those might be really helpful for you. And then maybe we'll get to do a part 2 someday and we can chat with you all again and actually make some mounts together. Who knows when, but someday, hopefully. And that being said, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing for a second and see if we can just open it up to Q&A. Yeah, so Ashley and Dominique can probably unmute if you want.
All right, I saw a couple of questions in the chat. All right, one of them was asking, are you familiar with Ava foam? Have you used it for artifact storage? I like it a lot because it can be laser cut for precision measurements, and not a lot of other foams are. Yes, I believe that is okay for artifact storage. It's just a different style and density. As long as it's made out of polyethylene, you should be good to go. I've not had experience with laser cut for precision. Typically the applications I've seen that happen in are for really large yet really fragile items. So I think I had a colleague, they had to make, I believe for a mummy, some sort of transportation mount. And like at that size and scale and for how old it was, like you can't even just like hand carve it and try to fit it and hand carve it again. So they 3D scanned it and then laser cut the foam, and it worked perfectly. So you can absolutely do that. And then Elizabeth is asking, Ashley, where can you find undyed pool noodles?
I'm not entirely sure. That's something that the collections manager, Christina Kane at CU Museum of Natural History did, but I can definitely check in with her and see where specifically she ordered that from and then send it out.
Yeah, I mean, probably like 6 different vendor lists of like tons of vendors. So you can always check out their websites and see what they've got. Like you can buy backer rod at a lot of places, which is a lot like a pool noodle in a lot of different sizes, but some of them might actually sell bigger, thicker tubing.
There's one in the Q&A that I can answer. So someone's asking, part of our collection is spread out on shelves based on nomenclature, while the other half is stored in boxes. Which storage is the better method, boxes or open access? That's a great question. I think there's kind of like 2 aspects to it I'd like to address. One side is access and access to and safety of the object. Like what does the object need and within the confines of your space. If what you need to do is maximize your space, and the best way you can do that is to store like the same kind of object in one area and kind of the same sized objects in another area, kind of like what you have right now, that's totally okay. And then the other aspect to that question is kind of thinking about how your storage is organized in terms of object type or maybe culture group. And again, that goes down, that comes down to like the needs and access to your collection. If it makes sense, like most of your researchers are coming in and are saying, I want to look at all of your moccasins, and you can point them to the moccasin section, and that maximizes your space because they're all similar shapes and sizes. That's great. For me, my researchers, they want to see everything from a single culture group. So like all the Hopi stuff in one section, which is typical for researchers and tribes and cultural research. And so because we do have the space, it is arranged so that it's less efficient space-wise, but then you can see holistically like everything from a similar culture. So I guess to answer your question, whether boxes or open access is better, I think like think about your size, your space constraints first, and what you can do within that space. But if that means your collection is split between different storage areas and that's all you can do, that's totally okay.
Like people have a question about, my question is concerning displaying century-old newspaper archives. Is it possible, and the best way, plexi and mount both sides options? Yeah, I mean, the more fragile your material, the more difficult it is to display. That's just kind of the basic answer. But I've seen newspaper displayed framed, if that's like framed and matted, if that's an option. But of course, that only is giving you one side. So yeah, we've done newspapers in exhibits on like book cradles essentially, which might just be on a sheet of plexiglass with like a little lip and then at a very slight angle, and then strapped down with that poly strapping. And if it's a large sheet, like you might need 5 or 6 straps to really like safely hold it down. But yeah, if you want to be able to see both sides, then some kind of plexiglass is probably going to be your best bet. But if you are thinking more for temporary exhibits, but if you're thinking of like a permanent exhibit, then framing is going to be a more long-term safe solution. And then it looks like someone just asked, do you have to use further mount making techniques to account for earthquakes? If so, what techniques? Oh yeah. Our mount making is often considered like way over the top because of earthquakes in California, and also because we're in an airport, and that's very open to the public, and people have luggage carts and they bump into our cases with their luggage carts like all the time. And there's just a lot of vibration at the airport in general with planes moving around. So we are like way over the top with our mount making. And usually that just means that not only are we accounting for side to side, front to back movement, but we're also accounting for up and down movement. So we almost always have to secure everything down, which for like a brass mount, I'm gonna use my cup. If you had a vase and you had a mount going all the way up to the top, some places would just kind of end the mount here maybe, but we might go all the way up to the top and then go over the lip and really anchor it down. And that would be like a removable drop that you could use to kind of anchor something down as well. Because yeah, our concern is often things jumping. And so when we're making mounts, we call it our little earthquake test. And yeah, it's on a board and I'm making the mount, and then I just kind of jiggle the board a couple times, and if it moves too much, okay, I'm not done. I need to add a couple of more components, or I need to go higher up the sides or something. But usually like that little jiggle is as much as an earthquake is going to be. And we often say, like, if it's the big one, the ceiling's gonna fall, so our mount's not gonna do that much. But if it's a little one, then that little drop or something might really help. And like you could see with our paintings, like we're doing brackets on the bottom, brackets on the top, brackets on the sides, and that's probably overkill for a lot of places, but that's because of earthquakes. Okay, I think maybe I can answer this other one too. Can you discuss tips when mounting objects on sensitive, difficult surfaces? I'm thinking specifically about brick. If you're thinking about like drilling into brick or something, it's really challenging, and I like wouldn't recommend it. You need like special impact driver drill and like masonry drill bits, and it's a lot of effort. I've had to hang some stuff in concrete, and it's a lot. And so if you don't need to do something like that, I would recommend like building a false surface, like building a false wall in front of that. And you can kind of faux it with brick and get like creative with painting, but like maybe putting up a false panel or wall and then mounting to that. Or if it's like brick on the floor, similarly, like maybe just putting down a panel of wood and then using that as your surface, but you can make a pretend, you know, paint match of brick. And we do that kind of often in displays where like we want to look like we're mounting on this fancy wallpaper or something, but we actually have a false panel in front of it. Dominique, you probably worked with hides. Ashley, you too, maybe.
For painted hides, I've almost always seen like it has to be some sort of slant board or slanted surface. But I'm not sure about like what's holding it onto that slant board to keep it from sliding down.
I know at the Denver Art Museum, when I was working there taking things off display, a lot of their painted hides that they had, they were either on like slant boards or they were on the wall and attached with magnets. So kind of like Jesse had showed. So they just like painted the magnets to match the paint. So
yeah, I've seen magnets hold up textiles and paper, like paper tapa cloth and like all kinds of hides. Like magnets can work for a lot. And then if you're having to use a lot of magnets because it's a big surface, you can use the same kind of like fauxing techniques and kind of paint the top and then put a barrier in between that and the actual hide. Or like we often just use that poly suede that you can get from a company like Benchmark, and we wrap the whole magnet in that safe barrier material so that no matter what happens with the magnet when you're taking it off, it's all covered. But you can try to get that to color match the hide so that it doesn't look like a million magnets. But yeah, a slanted board and magnets would also be really good.
Have any other questions before we kind of close our webinar?
Yeah,
and if you can't think of them, oh no, go ahead.
I was just going to say that a couple of people asked about contact info, like if you encounter a project and you're like, I don't know, but I think those panelists talked about it. Our contact info is in the follow-up email. And if you go to the resource folder, I've included these slides. And so our contact info is in there too. And you can call us or contact us or email us or whatever with any questions, like a specific project and you're just totally stuck. We can at least point you towards someone.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for enlightening us once again. This has been great and super informative. Maybe I'll have you guys again for a whole new topic next time. But for everyone who attended with us today, keep an eye on your inbox tomorrow. You'll be receiving an email that has a link to the resources, contact information, and then also information on where you can view the recording of this webinar. It'll be available through Zoom for a little bit, and we'll try to get it up onto the QAM website and YouTube channel as soon as possible. So if you didn't make it to this one, or if you want to share it, feel free to pass it around. We love to share our resources. And the last thing in that email is a link to a really quick survey. So this webinar was actually the result of one of the previous surveys. So if there are other topics that you want to learn about, please let us know. And QAM will do our best to find some experts to enlighten us all. All right.
There's one more quick question in the Q&A that just popped up actually.
Oh, sure.
So it says, do the magnets damage the object in any way, and can you prevent that? Again, it depends. I would say that from what I've seen, if you're using them for a temporary show and they're only going to be there for a couple months, you should be pretty safe, especially if you're using like felt, suede, or some kind of in-between material so that the magnet is not directly touching the object and like putting all that pressure right on the object. If you're thinking of like a years-long permanent display, then they could cause damage. So you might want to come up with a more permanent solution that isn't lots of little points of impact. But for a few months, for a year maybe, like that's fine. But it's not a forever solution. Someone,
One more question.
Someone just said, how do you recommend connecting pieces of plexi? So plexi is usually connected, like if you're thinking of like a board and a lip, it's an adhesive that you use to connect it, and we'll similarly, like Dominique was talking about with Mylar, we'll sand the edges so that there's a rough surface for the adhesive to join them together. And that adhesive is incredibly bad for you. So you need to wear a respirator for sure when you're working with plexiglass, because that adhesive is strong enough to join plastics together, and it is not good for you to inhale it.
Good pro tip.
Have a respirator.
Yeah. All right, last chance. And if you don't get your question in now, these ladies are available to reach by email. All right, well, thanks so much. Stay tuned for more webinars. Let us know what you want to hear about, and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.